The narrative often focuses on, the colossal efforts of the major powers, the US, the UK, the Soviet
All
Union.
right, the big players.
Exactly. But today, we are diving deep into the complex, crucial, and often paradoxical role played by a nation of just 11 million people, Canada.
Hmm.
This is a story of a country that started the war really reluctantly, rooted in political fear, yet it ended it having undergone a complete national transformation.
The total transformation.
It emerged as a dominant global force in training, industry, and even tactical combat innovation, all while struggling mightily with these intense political and, well, devastating social crises at home.
That paradox is absolutely the central thread we need to follow throughout this entire deep dive. For you to really appreciate the Canadian contribution, you have to understand the sheer scale of that transformation.
Yeah.
We are tracking how a country that was primarily agricultural and still, struggling with the Great Depression, managed to mobilize a massive military and industrial output.
While tearing itself apart in some ways.
Exactly, while simultaneously navigating these deep internal divisions. Divisions over conscription, over race, and over its identity as, a North American power versus a loyal dominion.
So our mission today.
Our mission today is to prove, through the sources, that Canada's impact was far, far greater than its population size would ever suggest.
And to set the stage for that immense scale, let's hit some key numbers right out of the gate.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because these financial and human commitments are just staggering. The total financial cost of the war to Canada between 1939 and 1950, it hit an incredible $21.8 billion.
An astronomical sum for the time. And that money didn't just pay for manpower. It fueled the growth of what would become a global economic middle power.
And look at the military infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely. By the time the conflict ended, Canada had organized and supported the world's fourth largest air force and, crucially, the third largest navy.
The third largest navy, that's a point that gets lost so often.
It does. This wasn't just some small expeditionary force. This was a nation fully engaged in global war. A total of 1.1 million men and women ultimately served in uniform.
And that naval component is so critical, especially when you think about the Battle of the Atlantic.
It was the lifeline. The Canadian Merchant Navy completed over 25,000 transatlantic voyages.
25,000?
Think about that. 25,000 trips across a submarine-infested ocean, battling both German U-boats and the vicious North Atlantic weather, all to make sure that essential food, supplies, and munitions reached Great Britain.
To sustain the entire Allied war effort.
It was an absolutely necessary effort, sustained from 1939 right up until the surrender.
Yet, despite this colossal eventual output, the beginning of this journey was, well, it was anything but enthusiastic. Canada was the oldest dominion in the British Empire, but it was conspicuously reluctant to jump into the conflict the moment Britain declared war in September 1939.
And that reluctance was a direct result of political trauma. You have to remember the Conscription Crisis of 1917.
From the First World War.
Exactly. It deeply and violently fractured the country along linguistic lines, pitting French Canadians against English Canadians. And the Prime Minister in 1939, William Lyon Mackenzie King, had experienced that split firsthand.
So he was terrified of a repeat.
Absolutely determined to avoid it. His political mandate, above all else, was domestic unity.
So his priority was political preservation, not military glory.
Precisely. This is why Canada delayed its entry by a week after Britain declared war. The Canadian government insisted they would consult Parliament first.
Asserting their independence.
Yes, it was a symbolic but vital assertion of political autonomy and a clear signal the King intended to control the pace and the method of Canada's military commitment to keep the country together.
That sets up the fascinating strategic tightrope King had to walk, attempting to balance loyalty to the Commonwealth with, political survival at home.
Yeah.
So we have this reluctant start, driven by a deep fear of political fracture, but what followed was an absolute revolution on the home front. It transformed Canada from a country still sort of stumbling out of the Great Depression into what many Allied strategists recognized as the arsenal of the North.
The war effort acted as an immense catalyst for change. Before 1939, Canada was still heavily reliant on agriculture and resource extraction. The war immediately pushed the country toward becoming a modern, urban, and industrialized nation.
And the initial mobilization strategy really reflected King's caution.
It did. The plan limited the army to just one division for overseas deployment, plus a reserve for home defense. The goal was to contribute, but to keep the commitment limited.
But those initial schemes, as they were called, were quickly, well, obliterated by the demands of a global war.
They were. By war's end, the Army had enlisted 730,000 personnel. The Air Force was at 260,000, and the Navy at 115,000.
Over a million people.
Over a million people in total. But what's crucial to note here is the strategic paradox we talked about. Approximately half of the Army and 3/4 of the Air Force personnel never actually left the country.
So they were trained and ready, but held back.
Right. They remained deployed within Canada or North America, which really reflects King's political need to focus on domestic defense and training capacity over immediate high-casualty overseas deployment.
And that strategic focus on capacity leads directly to what Prime Minister King himself considered Canada's single most effective and safest contribution, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan,
The BCATP.
or BCATP.
This is truly Canada's defining military role of the war. It was signed on December 17, 1939, and it was an extraordinary piece of logistical and political genius.
Oh, so.
It designated Canada as the primary safest training ground for Allied airmen pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, radio operators for the entire Commonwealth.
And this is where it gets really interesting from a strategic perspective. King saw the BCATP as a way to lead a massive, crucial Allied effort,
Training air forces for Britain, Australia, and New Zealand.
without ever having to demand immediate conscription for the army, which was his greatest political fear. It was a calculated, brilliant political shield.
The sources reveal his absolute dedication to this approach. He privately complained, even after the war began, that he would never have sent the 1st Canadian Division to Britain if the BCATP proposal had arrived 10 days earlier.
Wow.
Believing, and I'm quoting here, a big RCAF could never lead to conscription, he was willing to risk the lives of airmen, who were primarily volunteers, to avoid the political cost of drafting infantrymen.
And the sheer physical and educational output of the BCATP is just phenomenal.
It completely transformed the country's capabilities. Before the war, Canada trained maybe 125 pilots a year.
Okay.
Under this plan, operating from hundreds of newly built facilities, it churned out 1,460 airmen every 4 weeks.
Every 4 weeks. That's an incredible ramp up.
Over the course of the program, more than 130,000 aircrew were trained on Canadian soil.
Mhm.
And you have to think of the cultural shift. Training bases sprang up in tiny towns across the prairies, bringing thousands of young men from around the world into formerly isolated communities.
And the RCAF itself became a massive force within the Allied effort.
It did. The RCAF accounted for 1 in every 6 Bomber Command groups flying over Europe. Many Canadians flew under the RAF banner, but the sheer volume of Canadian-trained airmen flooding into the Allied air forces was arguably the single most important Canadian military contribution to winning the war in the air.
And that required insane infrastructure construction, all seemingly overnight. Let's look at an example like Uplands Airport in Ottawa, which became #2 service flying training school.
That facility truly did, as they said, spring out of the ground overnight. They used an existing civilian field, but in just a few months they constructed roughly 40 massive buildings and 8,000 feet of runways.
This wasn't just a few barracks.
Oh no. This complex included 5 enormous double hangars, a supply depot, quarters for 1,100 military and civilian personnel, and a fully functional 34-bed hospital.
Incredible.
The logistics alone required installing special storage tanks for 20,000 gallons of aviation fuel and setting up elaborate communication systems in remote areas across the country. This rapid, decentralized national mobilization was truly unprecedented.
The industrial mobilization was equally swift and impressive. Canada achieved the world's 4th largest wartime production capability. How did a country still reeling from the Depression manage that kind of overwhelming output so quickly?
That success was thanks to an initiative called the Bits and Pieces program.
Bits and pieces.
It was a masterclass in supply chain decentralization, led by Harry J. Carmichael, who was on loan from General Motors and famously worked for $1 a year.
The genius of this initiative was what, exactly?
It was subcontracting work to literally hundreds of small factories across the country. The British purchasing missions had initially assessed Canada's secondary manufacturing sector as weak. They rated many small Canadian factories as, and I quote, little better than garages.
So Carmichael's approach was to use those garages.
Exactly. It bypassed the need to build entirely new, massive, centralized munitions plants by tapping into existing, underutilized local capacity. It created instant productivity.
And the stories of these industrial transformations are fantastic. You have companies that made consumer goods suddenly pivoting to high-precision military equipment.
Right. Take the Canadian Cycle and Motor Co. in Weston. They previously manufactured bicycles and hockey skates.
Very Canadian.
Very Canadian. They immediately retooled to make crucial precision military hardware, gun parts, tripods for Bren guns, and cradles for anti-tank guns.
Or the Liquid Carbonic Canadian Corporation, which specialized in soda fountains.
They switched their production lines entirely to building tank parts, components for Valentine and Ram tanks. This strategy of finding the bits and pieces of capacity, utilizing every small factory, achieved that massive national industrial output.
A uniquely Canadian solution.
It was, and what's fascinating is that this industrial acceleration didn't just support the war overseas, it fundamentally changed Canadian domestic industries forever.
How so?
Well, necessity is the mother of invention. The need for timber to support the Allied war effort was massive, but lumber companies faced a critical gap in personnel who had gone overseas to fight.
So they needed to get more efficient.
Precisely. That need led to the rapid development of a much-improved lightweight chainsaw by Industrial Engineering Ltd. of Vancouver.
That sounds like a minor detail, but its impact must have been huge.
It was revolutionary. This new design made logging more efficient, safer, and allowed people who otherwise wouldn't have been physically able to operate the heavy pre-war saws, including women and older workers, to fill those critical labor gaps. It allowed Canada to meet its timber quotas and cemented the future of mechanized logging. It's a perfect illustration of how wartime pressures permanently accelerated the modernization of the country's core economy.
While the home front was booming, the Canadian Army was pushing to see action overseas.
There was a lot of public pressure.
Right, people wanted them to join the fight. This led, unfortunately, to some devastating early lessons learned in the crucible of combat.
Before we get to the big ones, we should quickly touch on two early, challenging engagements. In late 1941, Seaforce, 2 Canadian infantry battalions, nearly 2,000 personnel, was sent to reinforce the garrison at Hong Kong.
And they were not prepared.
Wholly unprepared for the tropical environment, for the speed of the Japanese attack.
And the fighting was brutal and swift.
Very much so. After bitter fighting, they were forced to surrender on Christmas Day, 1941. That force lost 290 men in the battle itself.
But the tragedy was compounded later.
A further 267 men subsequently perished in horrific conditions in Japanese POW camps. Starvation, disease, abuse. It was a devastating introduction to the Pacific theater.
And then there was the deployment to the Aleutian Islands campaign in 1943.
Right, the 13th Brigade deployed to Alaskan territory. This campaign was about ejecting the Japanese from Kiska and Attu, which is technically North American soil.
And the conditions there.
Unrelenting freezing fog, difficult volcanic terrain, and the psychological strain of operating in near-total isolation. The irony is that by the time the 13th Brigade landed on Kiska, the Japanese had already withdrawn.
So their primary battle wasn't the Japanese, but bureaucratic confusion, right? The sources mention this famous fight with the tax collectors.
It's an entertaining but true anecdote. During their 6-month stay, the only struggle they faced was actually a fight with the Canadian tax authorities.
Seriously?
The servicemen argued that because they were west of the international date line, they were technically deployed in Asia and thus qualified for an overseas tax exemption.
A clever argument.
The Revenue Department, focused on the North American location, won that argument, unfortunately for the cold, disappointed troops.
But the real early crucible, the devastating failure that defined Canadian involvement in amphibious planning and cost thousands of lives, was the Dieppe raid.
Operation Jubilee, August 19, 1942.
Yes.
It was a disastrous attempt to test the feasibility of an opposed landing on the French coast, undertaken by nearly 5,000 inexperienced Canadian soldiers.
And it was largely a political undertaking.
It was. The Canadian government, feeling public pressure to commit its idle troops sitting in Britain, pushed for action. The raid aimed to seize a fortified port, hold it briefly, destroy key installations, gather intelligence, and then withdraw.
So what were the specific fatal flaws in the planning that led to such catastrophic losses?
There were 3 major systemic flaws. First, timing. The Canadian forces landed after dawn, so the element of surprise was gone.
Right.
Second, communications were a complete breakdown. Due to heavy German fire, communications from the beach often failed, leading commanders offshore to believe the raid was succeeding long after it had failed.
And the third flaw was the deliberate limitation of support, which sounds like political risk management trumping military necessity.
That's absolutely correct. Naval commanders were terrified of repeating past naval losses. They refused to risk capital ships, battleships, or heavy cruisers because the Allies lacked air supremacy.
So the troops on the beach had very little cover.
They had the small, inadequate guns of destroyers. And to make matters worse, planners deliberately limited even that fire to avoid civilian casualties in the town.
That is essentially sending infantry naked against machine guns and concrete defenses.
It was. The results speak for themselves. Of the roughly 6,000 Allied men who landed, 3,367 of them, an astounding 60% of the Canadian contingent, were killed, wounded, or captured.
60%.
More than 900 Canadians died in a single morning, and 1,874 became prisoners of war. It was the darkest day of the war for Canada's army.
And it's important to acknowledge the German reaction. They used it for propaganda.
Of course, German propaganda immediately described the raid as a military joke, confirming the massive scale of the failure to the world. And there's a small moving detail about the burial.
In the cemetery?
Yes, in the Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery, the headstones were placed back-to-back in double rows. This is the layout of the German War Cemetery that was there first. When the Allies liberated the area, they maintained that layout to avoid disturbing the remains.
Wow.
A permanent reminder of that immediate disastrous defeat.
So, given the catastrophic human cost, how can history definitively argue that Dieppe was actually invaluable for the later success of D-Day?
It was a brutal payment for knowledge. Dieppe provided critical, blood-soaked lessons. Firstly, it proved that capturing a fortified port city in an initial assault was impossible.
So they had to rethink everything.
Exactly. This failure led directly to the conceptualization and construction of the artificial mulberry harbors used on D-Day, allowing the Allies to bypass the need for a functioning port entirely.
So the logistical plan for D-Day was fundamentally altered because of Dieppe.
Precisely. Secondly, it highlighted the absolute need for specialized armor, what Major General Percy Hobart later called Hobart's funnies.
These were the modified tanks.
Tanks with flails, huge shovels, or bricklayers designed to overcome beach obstacles. The failure of standard tanks to cross the shingle beaches at Dieppe made these specialized vehicles essential for June 6, 1944.
And the third lesson?
Critically, Dieppe confirmed the necessity of heavy, overwhelming naval fire and an integrated tactical air force for close support. Both were absent in 1942 but fully present for the Normandy invasion.
The knowledge was critical, but the Canadian troops who paid that price must have felt a tremendous sense of waste. Dieppe may have been a quick, bloody failure, but the Canadian Army's next major combat theater required them to learn and innovate not in a single raid, but under sustained, brutal, grinding pressure.
Yeah, we're shifting focus from the wide beaches of France to the mountain passes and ancient towns of Italy.
Right.
The Italian campaign began in July 1943 with Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, followed by Operation Baytown, the invasion of mainland Italy.
And this deployment was, once again, forced by public pressure.
Yes, the 1st Canadian Army was largely sitting idle in Britain, and people demanded action for their troops before the anticipated invasion of Northwest Europe.
And the fighting in Italy was notoriously difficult. A slow, grueling slog up the peninsula against entrenched German defenses.
It was relentless. The geography was unforgiving. Rivers, mountains, ancient towns that turned instantly into concrete fortresses. By the end of the campaign, over 25,000 Canadian soldiers had become casualties.
But the absolute epicenter of this brutality, the battle where Canadian tactical innovation was born out of sheer necessity, was the small Adriatic town of Ortona in December 1943.
Ortona, known as the Italian Stalingrad or Little Stalingrad.
Why that comparison to the Eastern Front?
Because of the intensity of the close-quarters, house-to-house combat, it was part of the overall fighting known as Bloody December. The Canadian 1st Infantry Division, specifically the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders, faced off against the elite German 1st Parachute Division.
The Fallschirmjäger.
Yes, who were masters of urban defense. The environment was a chaotic, rubble-strewn maze of booby traps and snipers.
It sounds like conventional street fighting would have been suicidal.
It was worse than suicidal. Every window and doorway facing the street was zeroed in by German machine gunners. To move from house to house by crossing the street guaranteed death.
Which forced this incredible tactical evolution.
The refinement of a technique known as mouse-holing.
Okay, let's break down mouse-holing because it's a brilliant tactical workaround.
Mouse-holing meant creating a passage through adjoining walls, avoiding street exposure entirely. The Canadians used powerful explosives like the PIA anti-tank projector or cumbersome Teller anti-tank mines to blast large apertures directly through the party walls of buildings.
So what were these weapons like in practice? A PIT and a Tellermine.
The PIAT was a heavy, shoulder-fired spring and spigot mortar. It could punch a hole through tank armor, but it was also incredibly effective against brick and concrete walls at close range.
And the Tellermine.
That was a powerful anti-tank landmine. Engineers would strap these mines to a wall, detonate them remotely, and create a large instant door into the next building.
So they were essentially tunneling through the block, bypassing the German defenses on the streets.
Exactly. They would blast a hole, throw in grenades to clear the dust and disorientation, and then assault through the mouse hole. But the real masterstroke was the vertical technique.
Explain that. Why was moving up first so crucial?
The German paratroopers, veterans of this kind of fighting, expected the Canadians to attack from the street level. So they heavily booby-trapped the main doors, the stairwells, the ground floor windows.
Okay.
By clearing buildings from the top floor down, the Canadians gained the high ground and avoided those traps. They'd use the PIAT to blow holes on the upper levels of connected buildings or just drop explosives down interior stairwells.
So clearing from the top down completely changes the tactical advantage. You're catching the German defenders by surprise, fighting down into their entrenched positions.
It gave them a decisive advantage. But the fighting was incredibly intimate and vicious. The brutality on both sides escalated rapidly. The Canadian engineers resorted to using high-explosive demolition charges to collapse entire multi-story buildings onto enemy troops.
Just to neutralize them.
The Germans responded in kind, blowing up major structures to block Canadian movement and create deeper, more defensible rubble.
The fighting lasted 9 brutal days inside Ortona. How did the Canadians finally break the German defense?
By December 27th, the last day of major fighting, the battle had reached a fever pitch. The Canadians were done with finesse or cautious mouseholing. They resorted to what the sources call overwhelming firepower.
So just nonstop bombardment.
It meant coordinating everything they had and saturating the target area. They broke the silence with massive, sustained fire from tanks, anti-tank guns, mortars, and artillery.
A full-on assault.
The Loyal Eddies deliberately collapsed 2 buildings known to be full of German paratroops. The Seaforth Highlanders demolished a stubbornly defended mill with demolition charges. This sheer, focused violence convinced the German 1st Parachute Division that further resistance was too costly. They withdrew overnight on December 28, a victory measured in blocks and rubble, but it showed the Canadian infantry could innovate and fight against the best the Wehrmacht had.
The incredible victories in Italy and the sheer scale of the industrial output can't overshadow the fact that Canada was simultaneously fighting this bitter political and social war at home. And this internal tension came to a head with the recurring fear of conscription and the dark chapter of Japanese-Canadian internment.
Prime Minister King's overarching priority was political survival. He had initially pledged in 1939 that there would be no overseas conscription. But as the war intensified and losses mounted, pressure built.
So he tried to maneuver his way out of that promise politically.
Exactly. He ordered a plebiscite in 1942, asking the public to release him from his pledge. The question was deliberately vague. Are you in favor of releasing the government from any obligation, restricting the methods of raising men for military service?
So he wasn't asking for conscription, just permission to consider it.
Precisely. And English Canada voted overwhelmingly yes. French Canada voted overwhelmingly no. The country was split in two, exactly what he feared.
And that tension led to a deep, visceral societal rift, symbolized by the derogatory term applied to certain military personnel, zombies.
The zombies were NRMA conscriptsmen drafted under the National Resources Mobilization Act. They were only required to serve for home defense within North America.
And they refused to go active.
Right, to volunteer for overseas service. The name came from Haitian folklore, used by volunteers, because the conscripts were seen as neither fully alive nor dead reanimated corpses refusing to truly fight.
And that stigma was enforced by the military command itself.
It was profoundly humiliating. They were reviled by the volunteers who saw them as cowards. In training camps, officers and NCOs constantly insulted and belittled them. They wore a distinctive black tie and collared shirt, the zombie tie.
Right.
And the ultimate psychological slap came in 1945, when overseas volunteers fresh from fighting were ordered to wear the black tie, which they profoundly resented as a symbol of shame.
Despite King's political tightrope walk, the crisis finally broke in 1944.
Yes. The horrific casualty rates in Italy and Normandy finally overwhelmed his political strategy. Defense Minister Ralston's report from Europe in October 1944 confirmed the urgent need for infantry replacements.
So he forced King's hand.
He did. King, who had earlier written in his diary that sending conscripts overseas would be a criminal thing, was finally forced to act. He replaced Ralston, but conceded that 16,000 NRMA men would be prepared for overseas duty.
Yet, for all that political turmoil, the actual military impact of the conscripts was surprisingly small.
Remarkably small. Only 2,463 conscripts ultimately reached the front lines in Europe, and 69 of those men died. Politically, King won his gamble by staying in power and avoiding a total national split, but the tension remained.
And he was saved from a third conscription crisis by the atomic bomb, correct?
Absolutely. The massive expected casualty numbers for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, would have necessitated a new, massive draft, likely triggering a full-blown civil crisis. Japan's unexpected surrender after the atomic bombs saved King from having to face that.
Moving from one internal contradiction to an outright, calculated moral failure, the internment of Japanese Canadians.
This is truly the darkest chapter, where Canada completely failed to uphold the democratic principles it was fighting for abroad. Following Pearl Harbor, from 1942 until 1949, over 90% of the Japanese Canadian population, more than 22,000 people, most of them Canadian citizens by birth, were forcibly relocated and incarcerated from British Columbia, all in the name of national security.
The sources are clear that this wasn't about a real military threat.
Not at all. Security experts dismissed the threat. It was fueled by deep-seated economic envy and racial prejudice in BC.
Decades of it.
Entirely so. One Vancouver MP even wrote that Japanese Canadians should never have been in Canada. This racism was heavily subsidized by economic competition. For instance, in 1919, Japanese Canadians held half of all the salmon gill net licenses in BC.
So the war provided the perfect legal justification for what powerful local interests had wanted for years, to remove economic competitors and seize their assets.
That's precisely what happened. The government seized and sold off the property of the internees, their homes, fishing boats, businesses, farms, at absurdly low prices. It was legalized theft.
And the humiliation was compounded.
The government forced the Japanese Canadians to use the meager proceeds from these forced sales to pay for their own basic needs while they were confined in the internment camps.
And the injustice continued long after the war ended.
It did. After Japan surrendered in 1945, Japanese Canadians were still banned from returning to BC. They were given a choice: move east of the Rockies or be repatriated to Japan.
A country many had never even seen.
Exactly. This led to the exile of about 4,000 people. It highlights the profound and long-lasting hypocrisy of fighting a war for democracy while enacting such mass injustice at home.
Despite those profound political and social black marks, the war forced Canada to mature rapidly on the international stage, leading to major global legacies, particularly in science, technological innovation, and international relations.
Let's start with the scientific breakthroughs, because Canada became a major center for wartime research through the National Research Council and various crown corporations. These innovations were crucial for shaping the modern world.
And the depth of the Canadian role in atomic research is often overlooked.
It was a substantial formal partnership. Canada was a key partner in the Quebec Agreement of 1943 for the joint development of the atomic bomb. By 1945, the ZEP-0 energy experimental pile reactor at Chalk River achieved criticality.
What exactly was ZE and why was it so important?
The ZEP was the first nuclear reactor to operate outside of the United States. Its research was focused on heavy water moderated reactors, which allowed them to use natural, unenriched uranium from Canadian mines.
Which was a huge strategic advantage.
It was. And this research directly led to the eventual development of the CANDU nuclear power system, which is a major ongoing export and energy source for Canada today. That 1945 experiment laid the foundation.
A huge strategic contribution. What about the medical and technological innovations?
The list is long. Canadian scientists pioneered the mass production of penicillin. Dr. C.H. Best developed the method for making dried blood serum widely available for battlefields.
And the Banting Institute's work on air safety sounds critical.
It was essential for saving pilot lives. They built the first decompression chamber in North America, a human centrifuge, and most famously, they invented and perfected the anti-G suit.
Which is still used today.
Yes. Other practical inventions included electrothermal deicers for aircraft propellers, and even the development of effective anti-fog windshield fluid.
So, after defeating fascism and wrapping up those scientific efforts, the nation faced a huge logistical cleanup. This leads us to one of the most troubling environmental legacies of the war.
The disposal crisis.
Right.
The end of the war created an immediate and pressing problem.
Mm.
Armament depots were crowded with tons of surplus ordnance, everything from conventional shells to chemical munitions.
And this became a major public safety concern.
Especially after the catastrophic Bedford magazine explosion in Halifax Harbor in July 1945.
Yeah.
That terrified people.
It must have heavily influenced policy toward immediate disposal.
It was a wake-up call. Dumping surplus munitions emerged as the most efficient alternative. So from 1944 to 1947, Canada operated an ammunition dumping program along the coasts and even in the Great Lakes.
They dumped ammunition in the Great Lakes.
Yes. We know, for instance, that 150 tons of obsolete ammunition were jettisoned into Lake Huron near Dyer Bay in 1945.
So this efficient alternative from 1947 means there are still chemical and conventional weapons sitting on the floor of the Great Lakes and the Atlantic.
That is the modern reality. The danger of these sunken, unexploded munitions, or UXOs, is still very real today. They are dormant until disturbed. We have a tragic example from 1982 at Lac Saint-Pierre in Quebec.
What happened?
A severely corroded artillery shell was mistaken for driftwood and thrown into a bonfire. It detonated, killing Pierre Jantes instantly and wounding 9 others. The sources note that ammunition still washes up on that particular beach every spring.
A long-term, ongoing public risk.
Captain.
From this persistent environmental hazard to a towering moral triumph, the most enduring non-military legacy must be Canada's central role in shaping global human rights law.
Yes, through the work of one Canadian, John Humphrey. He was recruited as the UN Director of the Human Rights Division in 1947. He was the key individual responsible for drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
The UDHR.
adopted on December 10, 1948.
And it's fascinating how Humphrey's personal background informed his work on global injustice.
It gave him profound insight. He had endured bullying and marginalization as a child after his left arm was amputated in an accident. That gave him a deeply personal understanding of discrimination and injustice.
So what made the UDHR such a milestone document?
Its universalist language. Humphrey and his team insisted that the document make no specific reference to a particular culture, religion, or political system. It was designed to be applicable everywhere, to all people.
And his work was fundamental in inspiring governments around the world.
Yes, to create agencies to fight various forms of discrimination. The UDHR effectively became the moral backbone of the post-war international system.
Finally, we have to mention one of the most heartwarming diplomatic outcomes, one that demonstrates the depth of Canada's humanitarian role: the story of the tulips.
It's a wonderful, enduring symbol of the Canadian-Dutch bond. When the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, Princess Juliana and her family found sanctuary in Ottawa.
And the Canadian Parliament took extraordinary steps when the princess was due to give birth.
They took truly unique steps. When she was due to deliver her child in 1943, Parliament passed a special law declaring her suite at the Ottawa Civic Hospital extraterritorial.
So the baby would be born on Dutch soil.
Exactly. This ensured that Princess Margaret, born there on January 19, 1943, could retain her Dutch citizenship and line of succession.
The gratitude from the Dutch people must have been immense, especially after the Canadian forces later participated in the liberation.
It was, and heartbreakingly vivid. The Dutch population had suffered terribly. By the time of liberation, they were starving, reduced in some areas to eating tulip bulbs to survive.
Eating tulip bulbs.
So in 1945, the Dutch government sent 100,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa as a gift of eternal thanks. Princess Juliana continued this tradition annually, and it cemented the Canadian Tulip Festival, which still runs today, as a symbol of that unbreakable friendship.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, looking back at this vast history? We've traced Canada's path from a nation politically hesitant about war to a dynamic global power,
Whose influence stretched from mass military training to nuclear science, from tactical innovation in Italy to fundamental international law.
The scale and depth of Canada's wartime role is undeniable. Its impact went far beyond the battlefields of Dieppe or Ortona to shape modern technology and establish Canada's place as a technologically advanced middle power.
And ultimately contribute foundational principles to international human rights law.
But the shadow of contradiction is just as vast. This was a nation that fought bravely for global democracy and liberty, yet simultaneously enacted one of the most profound acts of mass injustice in its history.
Imprisoning thousands of its own citizens based on race, seizing their property, and then forcing them to pay for their own incarceration.
This raises an important question for you to mull over as you process this history.
The war forced Canada to confront its most profound internal contradictions. The eventual creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, spearheaded by a Canadian, represents a kind of aspirational redemption.
So what's the question?
Does a nation's true measure, forged in conflict, lie in the principles it fights for during the war, or the higher principles of justice and human dignity it strives to build and enforce in the aftermath? The UDHR, born from that wartime crucible, suggests the latter is the enduring standard.